We were a ghost story told to a galaxy that had forgotten our name. For 300 years, humanity had been a museum exhibit, sealed behind the shimmering vitrine of the quarantine. Our world, our cradle, was now our tomb. We lived in Bastion, the last city, a steel and concrete scar carved into the heart of what was once the Gobi Desert. Outside its triple-reinforced atmospheric walls. Earth was silent. The Great Blight had seen to that. It hadn't come with fire or flood, but with a creeping sterility, a whisper of decay that had leached the life from the soil, poisoned the oceans, and turned the sky a permanent, hazy shade of rust. Nothing grew. Nothing lived. Nothing but us. The carefully curated survivors, our saviors. The Galactic Compact reminded us of their generosity daily. Their orbital platforms, serene and silver, hung in the sky like silent gods. Their transmissions a constant, soothing litany of our good fortune. They had arrived in our darkest hour, they said, and shielded us from the final, inevitable extinction. They provided the atmospheric processors, the nutrient synthesizers, the fusion cores that kept Bastion breathing. All they asked in return was that we stay. The quarantine, they explained with infinite, patronizing patience, was for our own protection, a necessary measure until the blight had run its course, and they could begin the centuries-long process of planetary restoration. We were precious. We were a grand experiment in preservation. We were a lie. My name is Kalen, and my job was to curate the dead. As Bastion's chief archivist, I lived in the city's digital catacombs, a labyrinth of servers and data cores that held the fragmented memories of a world we could never reclaim. I waded through the ghosts of forgotten languages, resurrected corrupted histories, and pieced together the life and death of a species from the digital dust it had left behind. Mo saw my work as a morbid, sentimental exercise, a way to pass the generations until the Compact deemed us worthy of rejoining the living. But I wasn't looking for nostalgia. I was looking for a cause of death. The official history, the one sanctioned by the Compact and dutifully recited by our own warden, was that the blight was a tragic, ecological cascade event, the final, agonizing spasm of a self-destructive species. We had poisoned our world, and the blight was its dying breath. It was a neat, tidy narrative. It made us culpable. It made the Compact's intervention seem like an act of mercy rather than an occupation. But the data never quite fit. There were too many anomalies, too many simultaneous points of origin, a pattern of decay that defied every pre-Compact biological model. It spread too fast, too perfectly. It felt less like a natural disaster and more like a flawlessly executed assassination. My obsession led me to the whispers, the fringe data packets from the last days before the silence fell. I was hunting for a specific ghost, the Stargazer mission. It was one of old Earth's final, desperate gambles, a series of 12 deep space probes launched just as the blight was beginning to take hold, hurled into the void with the faint hope that someone, somewhere, would hear humanity's dying scream. The Compact claimed their patrols had found no trace of them, that they were likely lost to the void. But I had found a thread, a corrupted signal fragment buried in the logs of an old Martian relay station that had continued broadcasting on a forgotten frequency for 3 decades after Earth went dark. It was a handshake protocol, an echo of a probe trying to phone home to a world that was already dead. It was the ghost of Stargazer 7, For 6 months, I worked in secret, splicing my personal chronos into the archive's deep core processors, running decryption algorithms that bordered on illegal. The file was a nightmare of compact encryption, layers of digital locks wrapped around a tiny kernel of pre-compact data. It was like trying to open a bank vault with a toothpick. My only confidant, if he could be called that, was Jorik. As Bastion's chief enforcer, Jorik was a man made of concrete and cynicism. His world was one of ration disputes, illegal water stills, and the quiet desperation that festered in the city's lower levels. He saw my work in the archives as a dangerous fantasy. "You're chasing shadows, K," he'd tell me. His voice a low rumble that always seemed to carry the weight of the city's 3 billion souls. "The past is a tomb. The only thing that matters is the next nutrient cycle." He tolerated my obsession because my skills were useful for untangling the occasional data crime, but he watched me with the weary eyes of a man who had seen too many hopeful people break themselves against the unyielding walls of our reality. The breakthrough came on the 314th cycle of my search. A recursive algorithm I'd designed finally cracked the last layer of the compact's encryption. For a split second, the archive servers surged, drawing a spike of power from the city grid that I knew Jorik's monitors would register. I ignored the impending alarm. On my main screen, the data from Stargazer 7 unspooled. It wasn't a message. It was a final, automated diagnostic log, a stream of telemetry that was almost meaningless without context. Almost. The probe's sensors hadn't been pointed out at the stars. They had been turned back, observing its point of origin. It had captured its own departure. The log showed the probe clearing Earth's atmosphere, its trajectory clean. And then, a new contact. A ship, vast and biological in design, like a creature of the deep void, decloaking in high orbit. It bore no markings I recognized, but its energy signature was unmistakable. A perfect match for the benign orbital platforms that now watched over us. The compact, the telemetry detailed the ship deploying a massive, diffuse cloud of nanoparticles into the upper stratosphere. Stargazer 7's atmospheric sensors, designed to analyze extrasolar planets, had taken a sample. The data scrolled across my screen, a complex, self-replicating microbial agent. It was designed to bond with chlorophyll, to break down complex organic polymers, to sterilize soil and water with terrifying efficiency. It was the Blight. The probe's final log entry was a short, unencrypted audio file, the voice of a scientist. Dr. Aris Thorne, a name I recognized from the mission manifest. His voice was calm, laced with a horrifying, profound sense of defeat. "We thought they were gods," he said, the sound tinny and distant across 3 centuries of void. "They arrived promising salvation, a cure for our dying world. They said it would be a cleansing fire, a way to reset the biosphere, a sterile end. They called it a kindness." My blood ran cold. The truth was infinitely worse than I had ever imagined. We weren't a tragedy. We were a project. The quarantine wasn't to protect us. It was to contain their crime scene. The lie was everything. It was the air we breathed, the food we ate, the very foundation of our survival. As the final word of the recording echoed in the sudden silence of the archive, the doors behind me hissed open. Jorik stood there, his face a mask of grim authority, flanked by 2 of his enforcers. His gaze flickered from me to the screen, where the telemetry data glowed like a confession. "Kalen," he began, his voice dangerously low. "What did you do? Before I could answer, a new sound cut through the air, a sound no one in Bastion had heard in 300 years. The citywide alarm, a deep, resonant klaxon that vibrated through the floor plates and sent a tremor of primal fear through my bones. Jorik's wrist comm crackled to life. Warden's office report. We have an unscheduled atmospheric entry. A compact vessel is descending. He stared at me, the pieces clicking into place behind his hard eyes, the power surge, the forbidden decryption, the sudden aggressive movement from our silent guardians. The ghost I had been chasing had screamed, and after 3 centuries, something had finally heard it. On the screen, I pulled up the external visual feeds. One of the silver gods, one of the serene orbital platforms, was falling from the sky. It shed its placid, shimmering shield like a skin, revealing the dark, alien geometry beneath. It was not a station, it was a warship. Weapon ports, cold and black as empty eye sockets, slid open along its hull. The kindness, it seemed, was over. They weren't coming to talk. They were coming to finish the job. The city screamed. It was a sound I'd only ever read about. A composite of a million individual terrors, shrieking alarms. The thunder of blast doors slamming shut in the lower levels. The rising cacophony of panicked voices over the municipal comms before they dissolved into a wash of static. Yorik didn't hesitate. His hand clamped down on my shoulder, not with the bruising force of an arrest, but with the unyielding grip of a man anchoring himself in a hurricane. His eyes, fixed on the descending warship on my monitor, were stripped of all their usual cynicism, leaving a core of pure cold pragmatism. "What is on that screen?" he demanded, his voice a low growl that barely cut through the din. "The truth," I managed, my own voice thin and reedy. I pointed a trembling finger at the telemetry log. "They didn't save us. Jorik. They culled us. The Blight was a weapon. This city isn't a sanctuary. It's a petri dish." His gaze followed my finger, scanning the microbial analysis, the nanoparticle deployment vectors, the chillingly calm final words of Dr. Thorne. He was a man who dealt in hard facts, in the tangible evidence of a crime scene, and I had just handed him the greatest crime in human history. The comprehension dawned on his face not as shock, but as a deep, weary confirmation of a darkness he had always suspected lay at the heart of their world. He let go of my shoulder, turning to one of his enforcers. "Lock down this archive. No one in or out. Cut all external network access. If anyone from the warden's office asks, we have a catastrophic data breach. A viral containment." The enforcer nodded, his own face pale, and moved to seal the chamber. Yorik turned back to me, his focus absolute. "The drive. Give it to me." I quickly isolated the Stargazer 7 file, the decryption key, and a core summary of my findings onto a shielded data slate, my fingers flying across the console with a precision born of years of practice. As I handed it to him, the lights in the archive flickered violently, and the main city klaxon died, replaced by a profound and unsettling silence. A new sound emerged, not a noise, but a presence, a low-frequency hum that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones. It was the ship. It had entered the upper atmosphere of Bastion's dome. "They've cut us off," Yorik muttered, looking at his dead comms. "They're jamming everything." He shoved the data slate into a sealed pocket inside his armor. "You just made yourself the most important and the most dangerous person in this city. Kalen, which means you're now my problem. He grabbed my arm. We're moving. We left the archive under the guard of his most trusted men, stepping out into a city gripped by a paralysis of fear. The main concourses, usually bustling with traffic and pedestrians, were eerily empty. People were huddled in their designated emergency shelters, following a protocol for a disaster they couldn't possibly imagine. The only ones moving were the enforcers, their armored forms casting long shadows in the flickering emergency lighting. The hum from the compact ship was a constant, oppressive weight, a promise of violence that hung over every inch of Bastion. Our destination was the command spire, the central nervous system of the city, and the seat of Warden Elias Thorne. Thorne was a man whose family had held the wardenship for 5 generations. He was a creature of protocol and tradition, a man who believed so deeply in the compact's benevolence that he had become a part of the lie itself. We found him in the main observation deck, a cavernous room whose armored windows looked out onto the rust-colored sky. He was surrounded by the city council, a collection of pale, frightened faces staring up at the thing that now blotted out the artificial sun. The compact warship hung motionless 1,000 meters above the spire, a jagged shard of obsidian that absorbed the light, its sheer scale a violation of the carefully maintained sky. Thorne turned as we entered, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. "Enforcer Jorik, what is the meaning of this? Your men are refusing my comms." "And the archivist is with me," Jorik cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Warden, we have a situation that is not in any of your protocols." He gestured for me to bring the data up on the main holo table, as the telemetry of the Blight's deployment filled the room. A wave of disbelief and horror washed over the council. Thorne stared at it, his jaw working silently. He looked from the damning evidence to the monstrous ship hanging outside his window. "It's a mistake," he whispered, shaking his head. "A fabrication. The compact. The compact is here to sterilize their experiment." "Warden," I said, finding my voice. The Stargazer probe was an unforeseen variable. My accessing its data was another. They are not here to negotiate. They are here to erase their mistake. Us. Thorne, however, was incapable of accepting a truth that so completely shattered his reality. He clung to the lie like a drowning man to a plank. "No, I will open a channel, sir, direct communication. There has been a misunderstanding." He strode to the primary comm station, shoving aside a terrified technician. "This is Warden Elias Thorne of Bastion. I am hailing the compact vessel on the designated diplomatic frequency. We are experiencing a citywide systems failure and require your assistance. Please respond." For a long moment, the only reply was the soul-shaking hum. The warden repeated his plea, his voice growing more desperate, cracking under the strain. The ship remained silent, a monument to their indifference. "Warden, stand down," Yorick commanded, his hand moving towards his sidearm. "You are broadcasting our location and our command structure to an enemy." But Thorne was lost in his delusion. "They are our saviors. They will listen to reason, and then—" The ship responded, not with a voice, but with light. A single, needle-thin beam of pure, white energy lanced out from its ventral hull. It didn't move at the speed of light. It was simply there. There was no sound, no explosion. The beam struck the city's primary atmospheric processor, the massive facility on the western edge of the dome that scrubbed the air and maintained the delicate pressure balance. The entire superstructure, a testament to 3 centuries of engineering, didn't blow apart. It simply ceased to exist, dissolving into a shimmering cloud of its constituent atoms that was immediately vented into the toxic wasteland outside. A new alarm began to sound, a frantic, high-pitched wail, the atmospheric integrity alert. Red lights flashed across the observation deck, a pressure loss in Sector Gamma, air toxicity rising. The automated systems were already trying to compensate, but the damage was catastrophic. We were now breathing on borrowed time. The council erupted into chaos. Thorn stared at the screen displaying the processor's flatlining diagnostics, his face ashen. The illusion had been vaporized. They wouldn't, he stammered. You have to get that data out. Yorick said to me, his voice a low, urgent whisper amidst the panic. Not just out of this room, out of the city, out of the system. How? I asked, my mind reeling. We're in a bottle, and they just put the cork in. Yorick's eyes scanned the room, calculating, discarding options. The archives, he said. You live in the past. Kalen, is there anything in there from the beginning, before them, before fusion cores and centralized networks? How did the first generation plan to survive down here? My mind raced, sifting through terabytes of memory. The original schematics for Bastion, before the Compact gifted them with their technology. The city hadn't been built on fusion. It had been built on geothermal taps, deep earth vents that were considered dangerously unstable. The network was a decentralized mesh, a web of armored fiber optic cables designed to withstand a planetary cataclysm. It had all been decommissioned, sealed off, forgotten. The Undercroft, I breathed. The old geothermal conduits and service tunnels. They run beneath the entire city. They have their own independent power source and a hardline communication array. A long-range transmitter aimed at a relay that was supposed to be hidden in the asteroid belt. It was our own message-in-a-bottle project. It was never completed. Jorik nodded, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. Good. The past is about to save the future. He turned and leveled his sidearm, not at the ceiling, but directly at Warden Thorn. Warden, you and the Council are hereby relieved of command under the Bastion emergency mandate, he declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority. You will be placed in protective custody. Your protocols have failed. Thorn looked at him, defeated, a man whose entire world had been atomized along with the processor. He didn't resist as Jorik's enforcers moved in. The hum of the warship intensified, a sign that its first move was just a prelude. Jorik grabbed me, pulling me towards a service corridor. The Undercroft. Get us there, now. We plunged into the city's metallic guts, the sounds of chaos fading behind us, the low, terrifying hum of the enemy above us. We were no longer curator and cop. We were fugitives, carrying the truth of our extinction on a single data slate, running through the forgotten bones of a city that was bleeding out around us. The real war. The war for humanity's memory and its last, desperate breath, had just begun. The Undercroft was a myth, a boogeyman story told to misbehaving children in Bastion's lower levels. It was the city's skeleton, a place of crushing pressure, geothermal heat, and absolute darkness. Abandoned a decade after the Compact's arrival, the schematics I pulled from the deep archive were 300 years old, ghost blueprints of a city that had been designed to survive the apocalypse, not to be a gilded cage. Following them was like trying to navigate a dream. We descended through emergency service ladders, past sealed bulkheads that Yorick's men had to cut open with plasma torches, the screech of metal a raw counterpoint to the city's dying hum. The air grew thick and hot, tasting of ozone and ancient dust. The polished, sterile corridors of Upper Bastion gave way to raw, unfinished rockcrete and conduits thick with the calcified residue of forgotten systems. The oppressive hum of the compact warship began to fade, insulated by a kilometer of rock and steel, replaced by a new sound, the deep, subterranean groan of the earth itself. It felt like we were descending into a tomb. But for the first time since the ship appeared, I felt a sliver of something that wasn't pure. Paralyzing terror. It was the thrill of discovery. The archivist's instinct. We were in a part of our history that had been deliberately buried. We were not alone. Yorick had assembled a small, hand-picked team of enforcers, men and women whose loyalty was to him, not the warden's office. They were grim-faced, efficient, and moved with the quiet competence of people who had spent their lives policing the ragged edge of a society built on lies. One of them, a tech specialist named Lena, had managed to rig a portable comm scanner that could piggyback on the Undercroft's ancient, shielded cables. As we moved, she fed us fragmented updates from the city above. It was a massacre. The compact wasn't bombing Bastion, they were dissecting it. Targeted energy strikes, precise and methodical, were taking out key infrastructure nodes, water reclamation, food synthesis, the central barracks of the enforcers. They were crippling the city, ensuring a slow, agonizing death for its inhabitants. They weren't just erasing their mistake, they were making an example of it. There were pockets of resistance. Yorick's remaining surface forces, cut off and leaderless, were fighting back with everything they had, which was pitifully little. Their standard-issue pulse rifles barely scratched the warship's hull. The reports were short, brutal, and ended in static. "They're hurting the population," Lena reported, her voice tight. "Automated drones are deploying from the ship, non-lethal variants. They're forcing civilians into the central plaza. It's like they're collecting them." For what of one of the enforcers asked. Yorick answered without looking back. "For the final sterilization, one location, one shot. Clean, efficient, no witnesses left." The words hung in the hot, stagnant air, a vision of absolute annihilation that spurred us deeper, faster, into the planet's core. We finally reached the geothermal exchange, the heart of the Undercroft. It was a cavern of staggering scale, a cathedral of forgotten technology, massive pipes, wide as transport tubes, plunged into the darkness below, siphoning the planet's raw, volcanic heat. The air shimmered with it. In the center of the chamber, coated in a thick layer of dust, was the communications array. It was a monster, an ugly, yardery, brutalist piece of pre-compact engineering, a massive directional dish surrounded by a ring of capacitor banks that hummed with latent power. It was designed to punch a signal through solar flares, asteroid fields, and the hostile silence of deep space. "It's beautiful," I whispered, running a hand over the cold metal of the control console. "It's a relic," Yorick grunted, but I could see the grudging respect in his eyes. "Can you make it work?" "The geothermal tap is still active," I said, my eyes scanning the power conduits. "It's been trickle charging these capacitors for 300 years. The system is dormant, but it's not dead." I powered up the console. Ancient diagnostic scripts scrolled across a monochrome screen, the text stark and simple. The system was online. The antenna's targeting motors whirred to life, a ghostly sound in the immense silence. While I worked, Yorick and his team established a defensive perimeter, setting up plasma charges at the main entry points. "They'll know," he said, his gaze fixed on the tunnel we had come from. "The moment this thing goes fully active, it'll create an energy signature they can't miss, even down here. They'll come for us." I had the Stargazer 7 file, but just broadcasting the truth of the Blight wasn't enough. It had to be a call to arms, a warning, and a legacy. I began to weave a new data package. I took the probe's log and embedded it within a compressed history of humanity, our art, our science, our folly, our resilience. I added Bastion's city schematics, our genetic records, the personal logs of 1,000 citizens I'd archived over the years. I was building a final testament, a digital ghost of our species. "Who are you sending it to?" Lena asked, looking over my shoulder. "The Stargazer relay." I explained, pulling up the old star charts. It was a stealth satellite, launched at the same time as the probes. Its last known coordinates were in the Kuiper Belt, hidden within a cluster of icy planetoids. It was designed to listen, to wait for a signal from Earth that never came. If it's still there, if it still works. "It's a long shot," she murmured. "It's the only shot," Yorick finished for her. As I finalized the data package and began inputting the transmission protocols, a new voice echoed through the cavern. It was not human. It was cold, synthesized, and spoke with an unnerving, alien cadence. It came from the comm scanner Lena had set up. "Unidentified energy signature detected. Sub-level 9. A pre-compact technology. Deploying cleansing unit." Yorick swore under his breath. "They've found us. Kalen, how much longer? The capacitors need to reach full charge for a single, focused burst," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. 15 minutes. "You have 5, he replied, turning to his team. "Seal the entrance. Buy him whatever time you can." The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity. I pushed the geothermal reactor to its absolute limit, overriding safety protocols that screamed at me in amber warnings. The hum of the capacitor banks rose to a piercing whine, the air crackling with raw energy. Through the comm scanner, we heard the sounds of the battle above shifting. The methodical strikes on the city ceased. The ship was redirecting its resources. The cleansing unit. We didn't know what it was, but the name left little to the imagination. The first explosion came from the main access tunnel. It wasn't the sound of a plasma charge. It was a deep, concussive boom that shook the entire cavern, sending a shower of dust and rock from the ceiling. One of Yorick's enforcers, a man named Riker, screamed over the local comm. "They're not cutting through. They're tunneling. They're coming straight through the rock." Then we saw it. The far wall of the cavern began to glow a dull, cherry red. The rock wasn't being drilled. It was being melted. A perfect circle of incandescent magma formed, and then, with a sound like tearing silk, the molten rock was pushed inward, solidifying instantly into a smooth, glassy tunnel. From the darkness of that freshly bored passage, the cleansing unit emerged. It was not a drone or a machine in any sense we understood. It was a bipedal construct of polished black chrome, easily 3 meters tall. It had no discernible head, only a single, glowing red optic in the center of its torso. Its limbs were long and multi-jointed, ending not in hands, but in an array of shifting, metallic appendages that morphed from blades to particle emitters to grasping claws. It moved with an unnatural, fluid grace, its steps silent on the cavern floor. It was a nightmare of alien warfare, a perfect killing machine. Jorik's team opened fire. A storm of pulse rifle bolts and plasma bursts hammered against the construct, splashing harmlessly off its dark carapace. It didn't even flinch. It raised one of its appendages, and a beam of the same white energy that had erased the atmospheric processor shot out, carving a line of destruction across the cavern floor. 2 enforcers were caught in its path. They didn't scream. They, and the rock they stood on, simply vanished. "Fall back to the array," Jorik yelled, firing a high-yield grenade that detonated against the unit's chest with a deafening roar. The explosion barely staggered it. Kalen now. I looked at the console. The capacitors were at 98%. "Almost there," I shouted back. The cleansing unit was advancing, its single red eye fixed on me, on the source of the energy it had been sent to eradicate. Jorik and the 3 remaining enforcers, including Lena, formed a desperate and last-ditch defensive line between me and the machine. They knew they couldn't destroy it. They were just buying seconds with their lives. The construct's limbs blurred into a storm of blades as it closed the distance. One enforcer was bisected in a single, silent motion. Another was impaled and tossed aside like a doll. Lena, screaming in defiance, emptied her rifle at its optic, the shots creating fleeting spiderweb cracks before it regenerated. The machine backhanded her, sending her flying into a bank of conduits with a sickening crunch. Now only Jorik stood between me and it. He stood his ground, rifle empty, and drew his combat knife, a pathetic sliver of steel, against a god of destruction. The cleansing unit paused, its optics seeming to focus on him, perhaps analyzing this final, futile act of defiance. On the console, the screen flashed green. Charge complete. Transmission ready. "Yorich, get down," I screamed, my hand hovering over the activation panel. He didn't move. He just looked back at me, his face bloody and grim, and gave a short, sharp nod. I slammed my hand down on the panel. The world dissolved into white noise and raw power. The entire cavern lit up with an incandescent blue light as 3 centuries of stored geothermal energy arced from the capacitor banks into the main dish. A beam of pure data, the ghost of an entire species, shot upwards, not through the rock, but through the very fabric of space-time, aimed at a forgotten star. The backlash was immense. The console in front of me exploded, throwing me backward. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was the cleansing unit, caught in the raw energy of the transmission beam. Its perfect, black chrome form distorting, unraveling, and then, like everything else it had touched, ceasing to exist. Waking up was like swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. The first sensation was a sound, a low, rhythmic thumping that I eventually identified as my own heartbeat, painfully loud in the absolute silence. Then came the pain, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to emanate from every cell in my body. I opened my eyes to darkness, a profound blackness that was suffocating. The air was thin and tasted of burnt electronics and superheated rock. My hand went to my head, and I felt the sticky, matted texture of dried blood. I was alive. The thought was a surprise, a small, unexpected island in a sea of confusion. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. The emergency lights on my archivist's jumpsuit flickered on, casting a weak, green glow on the scene of devastation around me. The geothermal exchange was a ruin. The magnificent communications array was a twisted, melted slag of metal, its great dish fused to the ceiling. The capacitor banks were blackened husks, their energy spent in one glorious, suicidal burst. The cleansing unit was gone, leaving no trace it had ever existed of Jorix and his team. There was also no sign, just the scorch marks and scattered equipment that told the story of their last stand. Lena lay where she had fallen, her body broken against the conduits. I found Yorick near the spot where he had made his final stand. He was alive. Barely. The energy backlash from the array had thrown him clear, but a shard of exploding rockcrete had pierced his side, pinning him to the floor. His breathing was shallow, his face pale and clammy in the green glow. "Kalen," he rasped, his eyes fluttering open. "Did it work? The signal? It sent," I said, my voice hoarse. I knelt beside him, trying to assess the wound. It was bad. The entire array overloaded. It took the construct with it. A faint, bloody smile touched his lips. "Good. A fair trade." He coughed. A wet, rattling sound. "The slate, in my pocket. Take it." I reached into his armored vest and pulled out the data slate. The screen was cracked, but it flickered to life in my hand. It still held the core of our truth. "Don't let it end here," he whispered, his grip on my arm surprisingly strong. "Don't let them be the last word." His eyes looked past me, into the darkness of the ruined cavern. "You have to get out. Up. The city is lost. But the people." His voice trailed off, and his hand went limp. I stayed with him for a moment in the crushing silence of the Undercroft. A lone archivist with the last living enforcer of a dead city. The weight of his final words settled on me. The city was a tomb, but its people were still alive, herded like cattle for a slaughter they didn't understand. I had sent a message to the stars, a ghost story for an unknown future. But what about the present? What about the 3 billion souls waiting for the end on the surface? My own survival was a miracle. My purpose, a terrible burden. Guided by the emergency lights of my suit and the ghost maps in my memory, I began the long, arduous climb back to the surface. The journey down had been a race against time. The journey up was a pilgrimage through a graveyard. The Undercroft was silent, the geothermal roar stilled by the array's overload. As I ascended, the hum of the compact returned, a malevolent thrum that vibrated through the rock, a constant reminder of the enemy waiting above. I bypassed the main service tunnels, knowing they would be watched, and navigated through a maze of secondary conduits and ventilation shafts, places no human had likely set foot in since Bastion was built. When I finally emerged, it was not into the polished concourses of the upper city, but into the maintenance corridors of the lower levels, the grimy, neglected underbelly of Bastion. The scene was one of apocalyptic quiet. The power was out, the air was thick with the smell of ozone, and the only light came from the red glow of emergency strobes and the eerie, ambient light of the compact warship filtering down from above. There were no bodies here, no signs of a struggle. It was a ghost town. They had been incredibly efficient. I made my way to the central plaza. To get there, I had to cross the city. moving through the shadows. A ghost in my own home. I saw the compact drones. They were sleek, insectoid machines that drifted silently through the streets, their single blue optics scanning for any signs of life that had failed to comply with the herding order. I hid from them, pressing myself into darkened doorways, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The city I had known my entire life was alien and terrifying, a hunting ground patrolled by monsters. The Central Plaza was a vast open space designed for civic gatherings and celebrations. Now, it was a concentration camp. The entire surviving population of Bastion, millions of people, were crammed into the plaza, penned in by shimmering energy barriers projected by the drones. They were huddled together in the cold, their faces upturned, a sea of silent, terrified eyes staring at the warship that hung directly over them like a new, black sun. There was no panic, no rioting. They had been subdued by a spectacle of overwhelming power and a fear so profound it had frozen them into a state of collective shock. In the center of the plaza, a raised platform had been erected. On it stood Warden Thorn and the surviving members of the council, their faces hollow, their fine clothes looking absurd in this scene of utter despair. They were puppets, put on display to lend a veneer of order to the proceedings. And then I saw the purpose of this grotesque gathering. From the belly of the warship, a column of shimmering, golden light descended, touching down on the platform. It was not a weapon. It was a transport beam. One by one, beings emerged from the light. They were not the chrome monstrosities of the Undercroft. These were the compact themselves, the architects of our doom. They were tall, impossibly slender beings, encased in flowing robes of a material that seemed to drink the light. They had no discernible faces, only smooth, pearlescent masks that reflected the terrified faces of the crowd below. They moved with a serene, unhurried grace that was more terrifying than any open aggression. They were gods, and this was their temple of judgment. The lead being, its robes a shade of deep crimson, glided to the front of the platform. It didn't speak with a voice, but with a thought, a telepathic wave that washed over the entire plaza, a wave of cold, placid reason that was utterly devoid of malice or pity. The experiment has concluded. The thought echoed in every mind simultaneously. The variant has shown unforeseen levels of data contamination and aggressive replication to preserve the integrity of the greater project. This iteration must be archived. Archived. The word was so clinical, so sterile. They weren't murdering us. They were filing us away. The crimson-robed being raised a hand, and the warship above responded. A section of its hull began to glow, a vast circle of white energy forming, aimed directly at the heart of the plaza. It was a weapon of unimaginable power, designed for a single, final, cleansing act. I stood in the shadows of a nearby archway, the data slate clutched in my hand, my mind racing. I had a choice. I could run, try to hide in the ruins of the Undercroft, and live out my last days as the sole survivor, the keeper of a truth no one would ever hear. Or I could do what an archivist does best. I could make sure the story wasn't finished. I looked at the data slate, at the history of our species, at the final, defiant words of Yorick. Don't let them be the last word. I had one last card to play. It was a desperate, insane gamble, a footnote in the archives of my own mind. Project Chimera. It was a pre-compact military black site, a theoretical weapons program designed to fight an enemy we hadn't even met yet. Its focus was on data warfare, on turning an enemy's own network against them. It was deemed too unstable, too dangerous, and was officially dismantled. But I knew where its central server core was buried directly beneath the plaza, integrated into the city's foundational pillar, a location chosen for its extreme security and access to the main power conduits. The Compact had taken control of Bastion's network, but they had only skimmed the surface. They wouldn't know about the dark, forgotten corners of a system they considered primitive. I sprinted from my hiding place, back into the maintenance corridors that ran beneath the plaza. The hum of the weapon charging above was a physical pressure, a countdown to oblivion. I found the access panel, its seal marked with a faded, archaic military crest. I bypassed the lock with my archivist's credentials, the system recognizing me as a legitimate historian, not a security threat. The door hissed open into a small, dark chamber dominated by a single, black server column. It was cold to the touch, humming with a power that felt different from the city's fusion grid, darker, more volatile. I jammed the data slate into its primary interface. The screen on the column flickered to life, displaying a single, chilling query. Target acquired. Initiate viral replication. The Chimera AI was still active. It was designed to be a weaponized archive, to absorb, corrupt, and weaponize any data it was fed. I had just given it the truth of the Blight, the history of humanity, and the schematics of the compact warship I downloaded from the Stargazer log. I hesitated for only a second. I was about to unleash a ghost, a digital demon born of my own species' paranoia and fear, into the pristine, ordered network of our destroyers. It was an act of pure, nihilistic defiance. Initiate, I typed. The server column flared with an intense, violet light. A wave of energy surged up, through the foundational pillar, into the network of the plaza, and, from there, into the control systems of the hovering drones, the energy barriers, and the platform itself. On the surface, the effect was instantaneous. The shimmering containment fields flickered and died. The silent, hovering drones convulsed, their blue optics flashing a violent, angry red before they began to turn on each other, firing their subdual weapons in a chaotic frenzy. The transport beam from the ship sputtered and vanished. The crimson-robed compact being on the platform recoiled, its serene composure shattered as the very technology it commanded turned against it. The weapon charging in the ship's belly wavered, the circle of white light distorting as a foreign, aggressive code tore through its firing sequence. I had not saved us. I knew that. It was too late for salvation. But I had given them a ghost. I had turned our history, our memory, into a virus. I had taken the archive and made it a weapon. The last word would not be theirs. It would be ours. A scream of defiance echoing through their perfect, sterile systems for eternity. And as the warship above began to tear itself apart, consumed by the digital ghost of the species it had tried to erase, I looked at the terrified, bewildered faces of my people, now freed from their cage, and wondered what in God's name I had just unleashed upon the galaxy. The chaos that erupted in the plaza was not the sound of a city dying. It was the sound of a tomb breaking open. For a moment, the 3 billion souls of Bastion were suspended in a state of collective catatonia. their minds struggling to process the impossible sight of their gods faltering. The serene, invincible beings on the platform were now scrambling. Their graceful movements turned clumsy and panicked as the very air around them crackled with rogue energy. The drones, their instruments of control, had become a swarm of rabid, self-destructive beasts. I staggered out from the maintenance corridor, my body a symphony of pain, my mind a maelstrom. I was the eye of a hurricane I had created. The air was filled with the shriek of tortured metal from the warship above, a sound that was now punctuated by the concussive blasts of its own internal systems failing catastrophically. The great circle of white light, their instrument of erasure, flickered and died, its energy bleeding out into the sky in shimmering, auroral waves of corrupted data. The spell of fear broke. It started with a single thrown rock from the crowd, a primitive, desperate act of defiance that sailed through the air and clattered uselessly off the platform. But it was a spark, a wave of raw, primal rage, the accumulated fury of centuries of lies, swept through the plaza. The crowd surged forward, no longer a herd of victims, but a tidal wave of humanity reclaiming its own violent, messy soul. They swarmed the platform, overwhelming the few remaining loyal enforcer guards. Warden Thorn, the symbol of their gilded cage, was swallowed by the mob, his final, terrified cries lost in the roar. I watched as the compact beings, stripped of their technological omnipotence, were surrounded. They offered no resistance. They simply stood, their pearlescent masks reflecting the furious faces of their failed experiment, before being torn apart by the raw, physical violence of the creatures they had tried to so cleanly archive. It was brutal, ugly, and it was a form of justice I could never have found in my data logs. But our vengeance would be short-lived. The warship was dying, and it was going to take the city with it. Its structural integrity was failing, and pieces of its hull, some the size of city blocks, were beginning to break away, burning through the dome's atmosphere in fiery streaks. The entire structure was groaning under the strain, a wounded beast collapsing in on itself. Panic began to replace rage as the crowd realized they had traded a swift execution for a fiery entombment. They were free, but they were trapped in a collapsing coffin. Jorik's last words echoed in my mind. The city is lost, but the people. The data slate in my hand felt impossibly heavy. It held our damnation, but it also held our genesis. I pushed my way through the frantic, scattering crowds, making for the central comm spire, the one place I knew still had a functioning, citywide address system powered by its own independent backup. The spire was a wreck, but the emergency broadcast console was intact. I slammed my palm on the activation switch, my voice, raw and amplified, booming across the plaza, cutting through the sounds of destruction. Listen to me. Listen, the city is not our home. It was our prison. The blight outside is not a death sentence. It's just the truth. There are shelters, pre-compact biodomes sealed deep beneath the surface, geothermal vents that can provide power and heat. The archives. The archives show us a way to survive. I was no leader, no orator. I was a curator of ghosts. But for the first time, I was using the past not to mourn, but to navigate. I broadcast the coordinates, the access protocols, the forgotten schematics from the slate, a desperate breadcrumb trail leading away from certain death and into an uncertain future. The Undercroft. My voice cracked. The name itself a promise. The way down is the only way out. It was a choice between two kinds of death, a quick, fiery end in the city, or a slow, arduous struggle in the poisoned wilderness. But it was a choice. For the first time in 300 years, it was their choice. I saw the shift in the crowd, the dawning of a new, desperate kind of hope. They began to move, not as a panicked mob, but with a semblance of purpose, a river of humanity flowing away from the plaza, towards the access points to the Undercroft that I had unlocked. I had given them a direction, a sliver of a chance. As the last of the survivors streamed out of the plaza and into the relative safety of the city's depths, I stayed behind, watching the sky. The warship's final moments had come. The Chimera virus, the digital ghost I had unleashed, was not content with simple destruction. It was an archivist. Like me, it had absorbed our history, our rage, our defiance, and it was now enacting its own final poetic piece of curation. The ship did not explode. Instead, it began to fold in on itself, its dark, alien geometry glitching and distorting. Lights flickered across its hull, not in patterns of damage, but in complex, repeating strings of pre-compact code lines from our forgotten literature, equations from our greatest scientific achievements, fragments of our music. It was broadcasting our ghost story into the void as it died. The final act was a silent implosion. The entire, vast structure collapsed into a single, infinitesimal point of light, a pinprick of impossible density that held for a heartbeat before winking out of existence. It had been archived. In the sudden, deafening silence, I walked out of the ruined plaza and into the city my people had abandoned. I looked up through the shattered dome at the rust-colored sky, the stars now visible for the first time, cold and impossibly distant. We were alone, a handful of survivors in a dead world, armed with nothing but the truth on a cracked data slate. The days that followed were a blur of struggle and survival. We made our home in the Undercroft, a city of ghosts beneath a dead city. We reactivated the geothermal vents, found the sealed hydroponic bays, and began the brutal, painstaking work of building a future from the ashes of the past. I was no longer just an archivist. I was a teacher, a historian, a keeper of the flame, sharing the knowledge of the old world, how to purify water, how to grow food, how to read the stars. We were no longer curated specimens. We were survivors. We were human. Some nights, I would climb to the highest point of the ruined spire and just look up at the sky. I would think of the stargazer signal, our message in a bottle, now sailing through an unknown ocean, a quiet testament to a species that refused to be forgotten. And I would think of Chimera, the ghost in the machine, my weaponized archive. It was out there now, a splinter of human defiance replicating itself through the compact's vast, interconnected network, a silent, incurable infection of memory. They had tried to erase us, to reduce our entire existence to a failed experiment and a footnote in their grand design. But they had failed. Humanity was dead, and humanity was now everywhere. We were a ghost story, just as I had always thought. But now, it was a ghost story that the entire galaxy would have to learn to fear. And in the cold, toxic air of our reclaimed world, we would learn how to live again.